Hi, I'm Natasha from the Findlay Creek Soap Company. Today I am making this wood grain soap. I made this soap for the Soap Challenge Club for June 2022. For this first soap, I was very concerned about trace. For this design, the soap needs to remain pourable for as long as possible. I used my usual recipe, which you can find in the description box below, because it usually behaves really well. But even so, I wanted to give myself as much extra time as I could to work. So one thing that can thicken soap batter is using a water discount. This means that you are cutting back the amount of distilled water that you're adding to the lye solution. I normally soap with a water discount, so I decided for this batch that I would include more water. Usually I calculate my water amount around 25 to 30% of the total weight of my oils. For this batch, I increased that to 35%. As I mentioned, the percentage of butter and oils is the same formula I normally use, but this time I also decided to not include any kaolin clay. I like the slip that kaolin clay gives to the finished soap, but it can also thicken up the batter, so I erred on the side of caution and left it out of this batch. Fragrance oil can also affect how quickly a soap comes to trace. I decided to use a blend of ruby grapefruit fragrance oil and tangerine fragrance oil, both from New Direction Aromatics. I've used the ruby grapefruit on its own in a soap before and didn't have any problems with acceleration, so I felt that was a pretty safe choice. Now, I hadn't used tangerine yet, nor had I combined it with the grapefruit, so I was taking a bit of a risk here. However, in general, citrus fragrance oils tend to behave very well, and the reviews from other soap makers on the New Directions website were really positive about the tangerine, so I felt pretty confident that this would be okay. When it comes to fragrances, the smart way is to test out the fragrances before using them. This can be done by pouring off a little extra batter when you're making a batch to test it out, or by dedicating a batch just for testing several different fragrances at the same time. But since more than just fragrance can speed up trace, I like to have a few get the soap out of the mold really quick designs in the back of my head to jump to if things start moving along too fast than the original design can handle. So another big impact on soap trace and acceleration is blending. Overmixing soap batter can really accelerate trace, and if you blend too much, there's no way to reverse it. There are a few things I keep in mind when preparing the soap to avoid this. First, I limit the amount of blending I do after I pour the lye solution into the oils. I stir with my stick blender a lot, and I'm mindful of how much I am blending and how the blend is going. Sometimes I find soap blending to be really mesmerizing and my mind can wander off. This is not a good thing to do while soaping because the lye solution and raw soap batter is very caustic, but it also doesn't help getting fluid soap for a design if I overblend at the very start. Second, I pre-disperse my soap colorants with olive oil before adding them to the batter. This makes them blend more easily, and the extra oil adds to the super fat of the recipe. Because the colors are already dispersed, I can blend them into the soap using a spatula or whisk instead of the stick blender or mini mixer. This is really helpful when using colorants that don't blend easily, like oxides or neons. For this soap, I'm using First Crush mica from Fizz Fairy and Orange Red mica from Windy Point Soap Supply. I mixed a small amount of activated charcoal into a second bowl of the first crushed mica to get a slightly darker shade, and a small amount of dispersed titanium dioxide into the orange red. The primary color is white, which I'm using titanium dioxide, and I've already dispersed this into a squeeze bottle, so I can skip this part. I split the soap batter in half, to which I add the titanium dioxide. The second half is divided into thirds, so each of the 3/6 got one of the pre-mixed colors. To divide the batter, I weighed the empty bowl before starting, and then I weighed it again before I divided it. I subtracted the weight of the bowl from the total weight, and then divided this by 6 to get the weight for each of the secondary colors. To keep the batter liquid for as long as possible, I also split the batter just before it reached emulsion. Now, it is really important that I make sure that the batter has reached emulsion or light trace before I pour it into the mold to prevent a separated oily mess when the soap is done. Finally, I wait to get to the proper trace for the design once the colors and fragrances have been added, instead of blending to speed it up. This can be kind of annoying, but it's also a chance to organize my workspace and start cleaning up a bit. Unfortunately, there's a lot of dishes when it comes to making soap, and this design is no exception, so it's a good point to get a jump on that. There were 2 suggestions from the Soap Club Challenge Facebook group that I used. The first was to pre-fill 2 containers. I divided the white soap between 2 spout containers. This time it was not precise, I just eyeballed it. Then I poured each of the colors into each container. It's important to pour down the side of the container so that the colored batter does not break too far below the surface and start to swirl. The second tip was to apply a thin coat of oil to the pouring side of the mold. This helps the pouring container glide easily along the side of the mold while pouring. I've slowed the video to real time to show the pour so you can see how quickly I'm moving the container along the side of the mold. Unfortunately, because the far side of the mold needs to be propped up, the lighting for this part of the video isn't ideal, but hopefully you can still follow along. The faster you move the container, the thinner the lines and the wood grain will be. It's also important to note how thin or thick the batter is. Starting the pour at a thin or medium trace is ideal. If the pour is too thin, the lines at the bottom of the soap will blur together. However, the batter also needs to be thin enough so that it won't have a chance to thicken up too much by the end of the pour. Practice makes perfect, so it's good to practice the technique on a few test batches to really get a feel for it. To create the knots in the wood grain, I pause and do a little wiggle or swirl the container in one spot before continuing. Just a little wiggle is enough. Once one container runs out, I grab the second one that I prepared ahead of time and keep going. Because I can't really scrape out the containers at the end with this design, I made a bit more than I normally do for this mold. I have a silicone cavity mold off to the side to pour the extra into, so I have a few bonus hand soaps from this batch. Everything went well with the pour, and I was excited to cut this one and take a look, but even before I got to that point, I was starting to notice some unusual things. First, the soap didn't harden up quite as quickly as it normally does for me. Usually after about 24 hours, I'm able to very easily take the soap out of the silicone liner, but this time it was still really sticky. I also noticed that there was a few funky little bumpy bits on the top of the soap. Once I started cutting in, I saw a lot of glycerin rivers throughout parts of the soap. All of this was caused by the extra water that I put in. Extra water means that the soap can heat up more during saponification. And because I usually water discount, I stick my soaps in the oven to C-pop through saponification to ensure that I get gel phase throughout the entire loaf. This time, however, the C-popping actually made the batter get too hot. This resulted in the glycerin rivers as well as the weird bumpy things on top. This just goes to show that sometimes it's not good to focus on one single aspect of the problem without considering how that will affect other parts of the process. I decided to go for it a second time. I'm going to speed through the process for the second batch. I decided to go back to the things that I know. So the recipe is exactly the same as my usual recipes. The water discount is the same. I even added the kaolin clay this time. Between these two batches, I had done another one and it worked totally fine. So I decided that instead of trying to tweak, I was just going to go with what I knew. The fragrance oil for this batch is called Wild Sage and Mint from Morouge, Canada. I'm using Golden Shamrock Mica from Fizz Fairy, as well as Sage Mica and Green Oxide from Windy Point. For this soap, I decided to color the main batch the light green color and use titanium dioxide to make white one of the accent colors, along with the two darker green colors. I was much happier with the results from this batch. There were no glycerin rivers. The pour still was very fluid throughout. I kind of wish I had added more knots, but by that point I was just really grateful to get it done. Another thing to note with the soap is that it's important to consider how you're going to cut it. Instead of cutting the single bars vertically, I cut 3 little mini loaves that were about 3 inches wide, and then I cut them vertically on the side. This really helps to accentuate the wood grain effect. I hope you decide to try this technique sometime, and I'll see you next week with a new video.